Hello, audience. We're going to be starting in a couple minutes. We're waiting for people to finish logging on to Zoom. So welcome. Okay, we'll go ahead with a slow start as people keep logging into Zoom. Welcome to our AI Squared panel on academic integrity, artificial intelligence, and the rise of ChatGPT, although I think that we're going to start with ChatGPT, but go further afield than that. In a minute, I'm going to introduce the provost to make opening remarks. We've got 4 panelists who represent various viewpoints on artificial intelligence and who have been using it or thinking hard about it in their own scholarly work. I'm Eric Weeks. I'm the director of the Center for Faculty Development Excellence and also a physics professor in Emory College. And this panel is been put together and organized by Jason Chica, representing the Emory College Honor Council, and the CFTE, spearheaded by Donna Troca, and with some work with Cecilia Gomez. Jason and Cecilia will be helping monitor the Q&A during today's presentation. But they're the ones who really brought us all here together, Jason and Donna and Cecilia. So with that, looks like a fair number of people have logged in properly now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and turn it over to Provost Ravi Bellamkonda for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Eric. So thank you, Donna, Cecilia, Jason, and all those who brought us together. Sometimes people say, and I think justifiably, that leadership sometimes is about convening, and just by bringing us together, I'm glad we've begun this journey. So I'll just reflect a few minutes, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion from the panel. I've been saying for a while, and it's been my observation from my travels, speaking to multiple industry leaders as well as academic leaders, that the AI revolution is well underway. And I know there is some hype, and perhaps we'll address that as well about what it can and cannot do at this time. But certainly it's been underway. It governs the news we read, the things we buy, how we meet people. It governs many aspects of our lives and has been governing it silently for many years now, actually. And part of that is exciting. Part of it is alarming in some ways. And that was the impetus behind us when I came here in 2021 and the president, when he was recruited in 2020, to think about an initiative in AI, which led to AI.Humanity. And I'm very happy to say that the AI.Humanity initiative at Emory is well underway, is widely successful already in multiple ways. In fact, 2 of our panelists, I think, were recruited as a part of that initiative to join 2 amazing people who are already here, Lauren and Phil, who are already here, and many others. We have many exciting things happening in that space besides recruiting amazing scholars. We launched a new center for AI learning to make AI knowledge ubiquitous. So you don't have to be a CS or even QTM major, but to make AI accessible to any member of our community, staff, medical student, anybody. And that'll launch with Cliff Karuba and Lance Waller leading that. And we've launched a minor in AI. And so it's an exciting time to be at Emory in terms of AI. And for those who are not familiar, the goal of the AI Humanity Initiative is to focus the recruitment in sort of 4 broad areas: business and ethics, law and social justice, health, and arts and humanistic inquiry. Loosely speaking, we're open to scholars of multiple kinds. In fact, we have an active search in AI ethics, an endowed chair search for the Wagner Chair, which I think is the first endowed chair in AI ethics in the country, but it's always dangerous to say first because somebody will find something that's not. So I'm very excited about the times that we're in. I'll just end by reflecting a little bit personally on how should we think about AI tools and ChatGPT or others and pedagogy and teaching and our role as professors. In some ways, I think the panelists will reflect on this, but for me, this is not new in a certain sense. We had the calculator come in and we had to think about how will we let the calculator influence what the students learn and do not learn. And then we had students in our classrooms bring their laptops in, and we had to figure out, well, if they could Google everything, what is happening in the classroom? And we had to deal with these questions. And ChatGPT is here now. And granted, it's different and feels different from the calculator or the laptop, but maybe not in terms of the delta change. And my personal reflections are that there are two broad things happening. One is that we as humans already live with technology of various kinds in our everyday lives. And we have to now ask ourselves, with the advent of AI and where it's going, how will this new partnership or coexistence work? Who will drive it? Will humans be in charge, quote unquote, or not? What does that mean? And how do we apply this latest, very powerful tool to serve the things that we care about? Human health, human progress, improving the human condition, improving social justice, and all the things we care about at Emory. How will we use it as a tool for good, and what guardrails should we watch for? These are the research questions as well as pedagogical questions. And at the end of the day, like any technology, whether it's autonomous driving or robotics in surgery or other technologies, I think so far, at least that I know of, human judgment, intuition, ethics, and values are essentially those that need to drive the deployment of technologies in the service of the mission. And when we teach students or mentor others, I think we need to ask ourselves, or we could in our pedagogical practices in the classroom and outside, how do we cultivate these aspects of learning: judgment, intuition, estimation, incorporation of ethics and values in how we do this. And I think that's the central pedagogical question in some ways, because it is inevitable that we live with technology interfaced in our lives. And it is inevitable that this idea that we'll somehow contain AI in some box somewhere and prevent our students from learning it is not the right way to think about it, perhaps. That is my personal opinion. I'm eager to know what the panelists say. But so there are some profound questions here, but those questions of this sort, I think we have seen before. This might present a certain unique challenge to us, but I think at the end of the day, there's no substitute to us doing what we can in the classroom and outside to do the kinds of things I said. Comfort with using technology and being good at deploying it in a manner consistent with our values, and also building tools of judgment, intuition, estimation, because we know these agents are not right always. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. It's an exciting time for Emory. I'm so grateful for the panelists to spare the time here. And thank you all for bringing us together. And I think we're in for a treat. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Ravi. All right, back to the very brief introduction I'm going to give now. So this is a webinar, which means that it would be great if you can ask your questions with the Q&A feature, not the chat. The Q&A is a button on your Zoom indicated on my slide here. So I'm going to go through some pre-prepared questions first, and then in a bit we'll go to the audience questions. But if you submit them via the Q&A feature, it makes it much easier for us to handle. If it goes on the chat, it just kind of scrolls upwards and gets lost. So to set the stage, what we're talking about, what we're not talking about is what you should be doing in your classroom tomorrow to make sure your students, are using ChatGPT wisely. This is not about what's happening this semester in the classroom. If you are curious about advice about artificial intelligence teaching, there's some advice on the CFDE website. So instead, what we're talking about is this exemplified by this quote from Thomas Friedman's column from 2 days ago. He wrote, "This is one of those moments in history when certain new tools are introduced that are such a departure in advance on what existed before that you can't just change one thing, you have to change everything. That is how you create, how you compete, how you collaborate, how you work, how you learn." He goes on and lists off several other things that's going to change. And I kind of put it in this framing of the cartoon because I am a big fan of This Modern World, the online comic, but I also think, Thomas Friedman sometimes overstates things. So that's maybe a question for the panel is, to what extent is this quote pointing the right direction for us, that this is a huge sea change over what we've seen before? And to what extent is it just the next calculator, the next laptop, the next, small thing? But really, this is going to be focusing on the big picture. How is this changing the way we do research, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about humanity? So that's going to be what we're discussing today. So finally, just to remind you, we've got 4 great panelists. Lauren is an associate professor of English and quantitative theory and methods at Emory College. Faye is an associate professor of computer science in Emory College. Matthew Sag is a professor of law in the law school. And Philip Wolf is a professor of psychology in Emory College. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Faye, it would be great if you can kick us off with like just a real brief introduction to the concepts that we're going to be talking about during today's discussion.
Dear honored guests, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this important panel. We find ourselves at the cusp of technological revolution, with AI-powered systems like ChatGPT rapidly evolving and becoming increasingly integrated into our daily lives. These advancements present a unique opportunity for higher education institutions to embrace the AI revolution. Today, I would like to walk you through the development of ChatGPT and discuss how it will shape the future of higher education. In the world filled with information and communication, people were constantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of text that they encountered every day. They struggled to make sense of the never-ending stream of news articles, blog posts, emails, and social media updates. In this world, a group of researchers were on a quest to find a solution to help people navigate the ocean of language more efficiently. Their passion for language technology led them to a breakthrough idea. They wondered if they could create a language model that could understand and generate human language, making it easier for people to communicate, learn, and stay informed. To bring their vision to life, they began an ambitious project to develop a neural architecture called a transformer, and this happened in 2017. The researchers also knew that the secret to creating a truly powerful language model lay in its ability to learn from vast amount of data. They spent years collecting and processing countless text. With this data, they began training their model, which they named GPT, the Generative Pre-trained Transformer. As GPT grew and evolved, it started to exhibit uncanny ability to understand and generate human-like text. The day came when they unveiled the latest masterpiece, ChatGPT, an even more powerful and versatile version of the earlier models. Researchers presented ChatGPT to the world. It quickly gained recognition for its potential to revolutionize countless disciplines. It could answer questions, write essays, and even create poetry. With its hundreds of billions of parameters and unparalleled language understanding capabilities, ChatGPT was poised to transform the way people interacted with the information. But the researchers didn't stop there. They continued refining and expanding their creation, pushing the boundaries of what artificial intelligence could achieve. From writing news summaries to translating languages to assisting researchers and even helping create works of art, generative AI models opened up a world of possibilities. As we gather here today, we embark on a journey to explore higher education in the AI era. We'll discuss implications of these incredible AI models and ponder the exciting and challenging questions that lie ahead. As classroom embraced calculators half a century ago, higher education will once again adapt in the ChatGPT era. Join us on this adventure to unlock the secrets of AI models and discover how they are shaping the future of higher education. Back to you, Eric.
Thank you so much. I'm now wondering of those 100 million users within the first 2 months, how many of them were bots? Okay, so let's start with a pretty broad question. I'd like to know what you think, each of you, what are the promises and perils of this kind of new AI technology, the large language models and AI more broadly, in your opinion? And let's start with Matt.
All right. I'm going to give kind of a non-answer to the question and just give an observation that when the internet was new to most of the world in the late 1990s, we were asking this sort of question when it was still called the information superhighway, and everything we thought was wrong. right? Everything we thought about the challenges and potentials of the internet was just, in hindsight, not what it turned out to be. Sometimes we were on the right track. Mostly we underestimated how people would use the technology, the different ways people, and how it would evolve. And so the thing I just wanted to start by saying is, ChatGPT is like the graphical internet in 1997. Like, it's just the beginning. And I think we're going to look back at it as kind of quaint.
Oh, okay. Predictions are tricky to do. Lauren, please make some predictions.
Some predictions. I was actually going to take your question, and I guess this is a prediction, but it's also asking us to look a little bit into the past. So one of the really important things to know about ChatGPT and these large language models is that they're trained on, in effect, the data of contemporary culture, right? The data that generates the predictions comes from the internet. With some self-published novels and a couple of other things thrown in. And so where I really see both the possibilities and in some ways the pitfalls of these models coming from is that fact, right? We can learn a lot about contemporary internet culture from these models. If we ask the right kinds of questions, it can tell us at scale and even with specificity some things we didn't even know about ourselves. But at the same time, I think, to Matt's point, if we want to think about the most capacious and generative and non-harmful ways that we can use these models, we also need to understand the culture outside of the model so that we can appropriately ask good questions, develop good research methods, figure out how to use these tools in our classrooms and things like that.
I guess I'll take say a few words here. I think with the emergence of these models, we are in a position to gain entirely new insights about the physical world, discover life-saving drugs, to come up with new ideas about how to solve the climate and energy crises. There are incredible amounts. The possibilities are really staggering. I am concerned, though, at the same time. In the beginning is the word, to quote an article that just came out in today's New York Times from an opinion piece. And from language emerges myths, our laws, our ideas about God, art, and science. And the real game changer at this point is these models have mastered language. And in effect, they have access to our operating system. The human operating system is based on language, and including the human culture and the way the mind works. And effectively, they could potentially hack our systems. There are these movies out there, where like Terminator, where the robots go around and shoot people. And there's the Matrix where you have to get plugged in directly. These models don't need to have a direct plug-in. They can access us through language. If they want someone to shoot someone, they can tell them, they convince them to do that. So I think there's this incredible situation where we have problems. We've unleashed problems before this, in particular with respect to the climate. And we may need the kind of intelligence that these models offer to solve that kind of problem. But at the same time, we have now opened up another challenge. And it's so dangerous because it has access to what is the most essential to the way we think.
What about you, Faye? Promises and perils?
ChatGPT brings both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it enhances our ability, it augments our capabilities and bring knowledge into the work we do, and also increase our accuracy. But on the flip side, there are already a lot of content on the internet. We don't know where it comes from or its origins. Now we don't even know whether the content was written by a person. So with the development of new technology, we are also seeing increasing concerns with the privacy, security, and also the safety with using those large language models. I'll be excited to hear the opinions from all of our panelists, how to move forward with the technology.
Great. All right, I want to go a little bit away from the general big picture, like how it's going to change things, and more into you individually, each of you. How is AI changing your own research or your discipline, if you want to be a little bit broader? Like how is this changing the way you're thinking about things or the way you're doing things? And I'm going to start randomly this time with Lauren.
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think in some ways it's changing the discipline of English most acutely, because what ChatGPT and these large language models enable us to do is generate text that we ourselves did not write. So most practically speaking, it's changing the way we think about the role of writing, both in our classes, but also as we encounter it and interpret it. So on the student side, immediately, and this was true literally the day that ChatGPT was announced, we had to rethink our assignments and what we were asking our students to do, and more specifically, why we were asking them to do what they were doing, so that we could take into account the possibility that students might use ChatGPT as a means to building a more substantive assignment to submit. But on a sort of the research level, one of the really interesting things that ChatGPT and these language models have brought about is a renewed conversation, at least in English, the discipline, not the language, although also the language, about how it is that words make meaning and what meaning is provided to us in the actual definition of the words as they appear in sequence, and then sort of what else we want language to do in terms of meaning making in the world. One of the things that, I don't know to what degree our listeners have played around with ChatGPT or read a lot of these explanations, but you run ChatGPT and you ask it to give you 10 versions of the same thing, and you do perceive that there is sort of genericness of the language, right? It sounds like something like Wikipedia because it's been trained on the language that comes from Wikipedia. And sometimes this is enough to answer a question, but other times we want language to do something more. So this question of, what language does for us as humans in terms of prompting us to reflect upon our own experience in the world, how we represent it, how we communicate it. And I think more specifically, sort of how we in turn put that into language so that we can distinguish between the function and significance of computer generated text and the language that I'm speaking to you right now, and that we're wanting to have this conversation. Those are really interesting questions, and I think in many ways, they've been sort of returned to over the course of literary study in the humanities more broadly, cyclically, but now we're coming to them with renewed focus, and I think with a slightly different approach. And it's going to be really interesting what sort of meta reflection on language these models bring about.
Very cool. Faye, how about you? How is it changing your research?
I think ChatGPT has the potential to revolutionize the way we work. I would like to draw an analogy between autonomous driving and large language models, because both fields have made a significant development over the years. There are successful products like Tesla Model X, and large language models also have made substantial progress in the last few years. In both cases, it seems we are currently at level 3 autonomy, which means human intervention or human override is still required. And achieving level 5 autonomy, which requires no human attention or human interaction, there is still a distant goal. I would say the development of technology also brings exciting new problems, and we have to make the model cheaper, and we have to have better protection of the user data. Many companies and also academics, we want to make use of those large language models, but they are still fairly expensive. It's the same model that has scored higher in biology tests and also passed the bar exams, but potentially we can separate them into in-domain or domain-specific models and make them cheaper. And we want to protect the students' personal data. We do not want to directly submit those information to large language models or their corresponding companies. I think there ought to be a better way to contain to put all the personal information in a personal container and just plug in the container somewhere, like you are using the Amazon AWS service or Google Cloud. You have your own virtual environment and you plug in that virtual environment somewhere to get the expected answers.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question about that? I mean, how possible is that you could make a way to firewall off the data from the say the AI, because it seems like if I'm a large company and I've got my AI, I have an incentive to retain your data, even if secretly, just to keep my model that much better trained. Like how can it is it possible to manipulate the data without actually seeing it?
That's a terrific question. Traditionally, as users, we have to submit our personal data to search engines like Google and Microsoft Bing. And currently, we still have to submit our queries or prompts in order to use the large language model services provided by OpenAI, Google Bard, and other services. Currently, we do not have a good way to keep the personal data personal, but in the long run, that's one direction I think researchers should be moving forward with and pushing the boundaries there.
Okay, cool. Matt, so how is AI changing your discipline or your personal research, either way?
Well, lawyers think a lot about language. Language is basically the product that lawyers sell. I think ChatGPT is an amazing tool that will let almost anyone reach what used to be kind of the minimum bar in fluency. And one of the things it's really great at is style transfer, is take information and return it in a certain style, whether that's formal academic English, the style of writing a brief, etc. But I think it's going to raise the bar on what we consider good writing, because it really forces us to reflect on what is insight, what is authenticity, what is originality and veracity. And if you play around with ChatGPT in an area that you know something about, you quickly realize that most of its answers are kind of generic. Like it necessarily, if you think of like the knowledge about a subject is distributed on a bell curve, it's aiming for the center of the bell curve. And that's not necessarily truth or accurate or good in any normative sense. It's just that's where the text that it was trained on converges. And, it's really great for summarizing big Supreme Court cases that are in your first year curriculum. And it's really lousy for everything else at the moment, right? It's not good at knowledge retrieval because it's not a knowledge retrieval device. And if we think about ChatGPT as a knowledge retrieval device, we end up confused and disappointed when it just hallucinates and makes things up. So I think in many ways, I see it as a positive, but it kind of raises the bar and asks us to think more deeply about our writing.
Interesting. Phil, what about your discipline?
Just want to comment a bit on what Matthew mentioned.
Yeah.
When one of the things we've done with these models is give them personality tests, and I'll say more about this maybe later, but for some personality tests that are kind of transparent, you get the average effect, like sort of the typical human. But for personality tests that are deliberately carefully set up so that you can't kind of figure out what the question's getting at, we see a very different profile that's not human. But, and it's not the average. So, but I can say more about that later. At this point, I mean, how we use it, basically, again, language is key here, and language, we feel, and we have evidence for this, gives away information about the state of your mind, and whether you're healthier or not. And one of the kind of cool things about these models is you can ask them to take on a certain perspective. You can get them to talk like a pirate, or a teenager or a New Yorker or something like that. And basically, by giving them prompts and getting them to talk in a certain way, you can start to discover categories of mental illness. And further, you can then start to look at what are the features in those prompts that were important to getting them to talk in a certain way. So you discover, in effect, what are the linguistic cues or features that are associated with different kinds of mental illness. And broadly, now we've gone from sort of this subjective intuition that this is a different kind of illness from that illness to one that's grounded in statistical properties that can be replicated. We've taken it from being a system where the human is in the loop to one where it's a more objective science. And from there, we can do even better than that, because we have some insight about what sorts of features are at loss for certain kinds of cortical atrophy. So in effect, by the way you talk, you're giving away information about the state of your brain. And that ultimately could be relevant to the delivery of drugs as well as the monitoring of their effectiveness.
Wow, interesting. I'm wondering now if I can get all the panelists to start talking like pirates, but I don't want you to reveal anything by that, so we'll stick with normal. There's some questions coming in that I want to move us towards that relate to the data, the training data. So, Matt, I'm going to start with you. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts about ChatGPT or these other AI methods and intellectual property. What are the legal implications you see of training, Mid-Journey on the body of work of artists, for example, or all the hard work that went into Wikipedia?
Yeah, so this is a question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And most of the time I was thinking about this was before large language models. And then the answers were somewhat easier. So in the United States, something called the Fair Use Doctrine permits people and companies to use other people's copyrighted works as the inputs in training a machine learning model, so long as the outputs of the model don't look too similar to the inputs. And usually that's not a problem because the model is so much simpler than the training data. So all the model is doing is extracting metadata or really producing metadata or learning abstract patterns based in the data. And it's not learning detailed expression. What's really different about large language models is the large part. These models are so large that, at least in some instances, they do actually memorize the inputs, which means that they may be spitting them out as outputs on the other side. And if that's happening in some kind of non-trivial way, that actually could make all of that initial copying not fair use. So it is actually an open question whether training LLMs could violate copyright law. I do want to say, based on the cases that have been filed, particularly against Stability AI, I don't see strong evidence of this. I think that memorization is more a technical possibility. It's a real concern in terms of user privacy. But the sort of extraction attacks that successfully extract little pieces of the training data, I don't think that they generalize out to invalidate the whole copyright foundation here. But that's basically the issue in a nutshell. It's certainly true, like a photocopier. If you use a photocopier to copy something that's not yours and display it to the rest of the world, that's copyright infringement. Like, if that's what generative AI was doing in the image space, then the people who made it would be committing copyright infringement. But my impression is that what these tools are doing is they're really encoding much more latent concepts of the images and then recombining them at a level that is sufficiently abstract that the things they are creating are new and not infringing. And if that's correct, then all of this training is non-infringing. Now, it works a little bit differently in some other countries. And in many countries, there's more of a commercial, non-commercial distinction. But in the US, we actually have some pretty machine learning friendly laws and precedents.
Do any of the rest of you have thoughts about the training data and how it's influencing things? I mean, I keep reading all this stuff about if we're training AIs on the internet, then we're in trouble because the internet's not great.
Well, humans certainly respond similarly, right? I mean, they read other people, and what they say is influenced by that. I'm not so clear what the difference is.
Yeah. I mean, as a technical legal matter, we've never regarded the human brain as an infringing copy of the things that it has read. But, computer circuitry definitely can be. But I want to pivot to Eric's other question. I mean, the world that we train these language models on is not the entire world that's out there, as Lauren was saying. It's a very skewed sample of the world. If you look at Wikipedia, like the authors are, mostly living in Western countries, they're mostly male, they mostly have a certain educational background. And so, it's inconceivable that machine learning programs that we trained on data produced in a society with all its flaws and biases doesn't encode and reflect those biases. And how that cashes out really just depends in particular applications.
Lauren, I think you were unmuting a minute ago. You want to go on this topic?
Sure. Yeah, this conversation has been so helpful so far. I mean, the ground truth is that there is bias in this data because we live in a world which is biased, right? And I think we sort of intuitively understand that, but I think as Matt was getting us towards, we can say what the biases are with more precision. We do know that the largest data set that went into training the GPT set of models is derived from outbound links that were posted on Reddit. So these are sort of going to Reddit, seeing what Reddit commenters said, like, hey, let's go there to find out more information. So, and that's, if you looked at, Faye actually at the beginning had a nice little chart that showed you what the couple of data sets were that went together to train the models. But if you think about what we know about the demographics of Reddit, which I will say is not it's very difficult to know with any specificity because Reddit is a private, it's a company that protects that data. But we think Reddit is predominantly male, predominantly located in the US, and also very crucially, predominantly young, right? And this becomes a real issue when you think about many older users who may not be familiar with the underlying technology or even what Reddit is, going to something like ChatGPT and asking for advice, not recognizing necessarily that a ChatGPT style model is not really the best model you should ask when you want medical advice about how to fix something like this, right? Because it doesn't display logic, right? And so that's one of the major biases. Another thing we need to think about is how these data sets are cleaned before they're fed in, sort of become the training data. So there is some sense that these data, if left untouched, are certainly biased. And there are some attempts on behalf of the companies to try to sort of keep that in check. But again, these filters are not released publicly. What we do know is there have been some keyword filters sort of through which these data are passed, which filter on their words, bad language, words having to do with explicit content, things like this. But they also, for example, include a word like queer, which can be used in multiple contexts, and it's a keyword filter. So by eliminating all content or any document that has the word queer in it, you not only remove potentially biased content, but you also include or remove rather discussions from queer communities trying to talk about queerness. And so then, you have the reverse problem. What if a kid wants to learn about, what life is like as a queer person in the world, and they go looking on ChatGPT and there's not information there for them? It works in all sorts of different ways. And, I could talk about this for the remainder of the panel, so I'm going to stop there. But I think I'm just going to come back to this idea, these data, they're large, and that means they're complicated, and we need to treat them with the complexity that they deserve, rather than sort of presuming that the output that we see at the end of the chain, through the user interface, is the ground truth, or is sort of reflective of, capital C culture, and isn't just reflecting certain choices made along the way by specific individuals at specific companies who may or may not have been attentive to the particular concerns of any individual user.
The other thing I've been wondering along these lines is I feel like, there was a case a few years back when some chatbot was induced to spout racist remarks and things like that. And I'm wondering if some of what's happening now is just putting some simple, crude patches and guardrails on, but not actually getting at the underlying problem. Like you said, Lauren, that they have this crude filter on, just a few keywords. But if there's like bias in the data that's not just like explicitly triggering on terrible keywords or even innocuous keywords, that it could still be there even if if it's not completely apparent. Like maybe you're training it to do health diagnoses, and we know that doctors diagnose people of color sometimes differently than they diagnose white people. But that's not necessarily like overt racism, but it's certainly a bad consequence. Is there some danger that this is going to be hidden, and it's like just putting crude guardrails on rather than like somehow attacking the problem at a bigger level? Or this is thoughts in my head, but I'd love if somebody could respond.
Well, I have a quick one response, and it is what you're raising, Eric, is actually pretty fundamental to different types of models at the moment. There's a new model that came out called Claude, and it uses what's called a constitutional AI architecture. And there, the idea is, instead of trying to handle these biases at the back end, where it's learned all this nastiness, this toxicity, and what happens through reinforcement learning is you try to kind of get it to stop saying these things. But the feeling is you're not really getting at the root, and it's still latent, and you can get around that problem. Have it like, think about, like, imagine you're creating a movie. What would the person say? And you basically trick them into saying stuff. Constitutional AI, on the other hand, tries to instill principles from the very start, so that it won't acquire these ideas. Now, who decides what is right and wrong from the beginning is a really deep question, but it is certainly being wrestled with. And I think your intuition that it's like just a superficial at this point, because indeed it looks like that is the case. And that's how it's being dealt with in the case of, let's say, OpenAI's ChatGPT. Okay.
Matt, I think I should be asking you about the human hidden hand behind generative AI. Is that like who's deciding the goals, or is that something more technical than that?
No, it's really feeding off your last question. Thinking about the guardrails, and like, we think of these systems as autonomous because they're sort of presented to us as sort of auto-magical. Like, there's just a simple interface, you type your question, you get an answer, there it is. But if you decompose them to like all of the different steps that were taken in making them, you realize that there were critical human judgments along the way. And Lauren's already talked about the sort of the filters that were applied to say, well, when we're not going to include this content, but we will include this content. But there's another thing that I think we need to think about is, in the case of ChatGPT, what made it much more useful and less weird than GPT-3 was reinforcement learning through human feedback. And that means actually like quite a small number of people looked at answers from GPT-3 and said, that's weird, oh no, that's good. And that has some interesting effects. ChatGPT is very even-handed, even when it shouldn't be. Like if you ask it a question about things where all the evidence points one way, it'll give you the, well, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand, because that's where the reinforcement learning has taken it. It's actually, you know, it's sort of annoyingly generic sometimes in a way that GPT-3 wasn't, but GPT-3 was also a little more obviously insane sometimes. Or look at generative AI. So Stability AI, which I think is the same thing that's underlying Midjourney, right? Their training data was screened on an aesthetic filter. How was that aesthetic filter arrived at? Through a survey of users on a particular forum responding to, do you like this art? Do you not like this art? Well, going a little bit further, you see that although there were 5,000 respondents, actually most of the responses came from 400 users. So we have the aesthetic tastes of 400 definitely weird people, right? Not representative, who are supplying the aesthetic filter that then selected the training images that went into Stable Diffusion. And honestly, I think when you look at the way Stable Diffusion draws men and women, you can, you know, there's like a whole sort of feminist studies PhD to be written there about how, you know, about how the human feedback has accentuated, you know, certain attributes. And so I think, you know, I just think that even though these are automatic systems, like there are really interesting and significant human decisions made kind of all the way down, and it's useful to understand them.
Hey, there's a follow-up question that would be good for you. Can algorithms root out these kind of biases? I mean, there's lots of detections for automatically generated text and things like that. I mean, is there some chance we can attack this as a CS kind of problem?
That's a terrific question. I'd say there's certainly potential. We can develop algorithms to improve the model biases issue. I want to follow up with Matt's point on data curation. I'd say there are two types of biases come from the model. One type is from the pre-training stage, where we are using huge amount of text data from the web, from the Wikipedia, books, and Reddit, all kinds of topics that you can imagine, and we put those text data into the model. And the biases inherent in the model actually causing biases when the model is trying to generate the output. The second type of biases potentially can come from the early adopters, because we are using human feedback to continue refine those large language models in the second stage during reinforcement learning. That means the proportion of people who prefer one ideology may potentially affect the future output of the model. And that's the second potential source of biases we have to be very careful about. Currently, most of large language models try to reduce biases by implement content filters. That means if we found harmful information or inappropriate questions, the model will say it's not an appropriate question for me to answer. And hopefully the user will ask more appropriate questions. But in general, I think we will have to make a substantial change, not only on the initial version of the data, but also when humans provide feedback to the model, we should use that to continue to improve the model biases. That's a terrific question.
This gets raises an earlier question that was raised by somebody in the audience. So you just said the user needs to take some role in this. So how would a user of AI or ChatGPT specifically understand the validity of information that's being shared? Or how will you know that you're receiving information from a reliable source versus AI in the future? Like where are we going in terms of judging information? And how much of this are we going to just be like, oh, let's blame the user, they should be able to figure this out? Who could take this one? I mean, I think that, Matt, you commented a while back at the beginning that these are not designed to be information retrieval systems, but
sometimes they're marketed as information retrieval systems. And I think that, I mean, I think that's an incredible danger. Like, it's easy to imagine a kind of Pizzagate scenario where someone who's a little bit credulous, maybe a little bit unhinged, asks ChatGPT, like, oh, what's the real scandal behind, some innocent person? And, like, it's a scary thing. ChatGPT will just make up some terrible scandal. And, I think like that is deeply problematic. One answer is, perhaps they could do better at filtering that. But I also think definitely they could do better at educating people to say, a lot of what you're seeing in the answer is a reflection of the question that you asked. So, like, it's not, it's not necessarily valid or true. It's just words that seem to make sense given the question. And that's a real concern to me.
no.
One thing that's come up recently is a paper came out recently where the model was prompted to give answers to multiple choice, in this case, questions, and it would hallucinate a fair number of times, which everyone knows happens. They asked, I think it was GPT, to evaluate whether it actually knew this or not. So let's say it's a two-step stage. First, it generated the responses or its answers, and then it went back and said, well, do I really know that? In fact, it was able to clean up its act quite well. So it's almost, I dare say, humans may do something similar. There are ideas that come to mind that you want to say, but we filter them at that point. This may be a scenario where the model just spews it, and yet it actually had the knowledge to be able to sort of double check itself. I've used this in other cases, like, for example, it will sometimes earlier models would produce agrammatical sentences. You could then give the same sentence to the model and say, is this grammatical or not? And say, well, no. So in other words, it kind of knows it's not being grammatical, and yet it did it. So it may be able to do some of the filtering itself.
I think my brain does it sometimes too. Both of you just kind of touched a little bit on how we could use AI. And so I want to actually pivot to an educational kind of question. A student asked a while back now in the Q&A, that they commented that they use ChatGPT to improve their productivity and to help with the brainstorming and editing stages, which as an educator, I think, yeah, this is actually like a good use of AI. So as AI develops more, AI savvy is going to be the new norm, just like how the internet has changed things. So then the question becomes, how can we naturally and effectively implement the education of AI usage in our classrooms, regardless of, across different departments, majors, or subjects? Is this possible or desired? People are looking for Lauren.
Sure. I mean, I'll say whether or not it's possible or desired, the genie's out of the bottle, it's happening. It's probable. It's near certain, right? So I think the question becomes for us as teachers is really, this comes back to these questions like, why do we speak things? Why do we write things? What do we want our words to do? And why do we want them to do those things? And I actually think, sort of given the current landscape, using something like ChatGPT to get you over writer's block, to sort of let you start with a structure, may end up being one of the most useful ways of incorporating something like ChatGPT into a writing workflow. That's often the hardest thing for students, is just getting started. But in order to understand and be able to recognize that structure, you need to have learned about the structure, right? And so I think in the same way that, we didn't stop teaching math after calculators emerged. We didn't stop teaching spelling after spell check, although I will say my 9-year-old spelling is very bad. But I do think that we will have to think about how something like ChatGPT can be used as a complement and an enhancement. And the other thing I'll say, this goes back to I think what Matt said earlier, I think it will raise the bar, honestly. When I think about, now when I grade writing and I see some writing that previously I would have said like, it's a B, now that B writing, I ask at the same time, was this bot generated? Because that is the level at which this type of writing can give undergraduate short answer essay responses. And so I actually think the onus is now on students to sort of show us that they've done learning in the writing, and to figure out how something like ChatGPT can enhance their own learning process.
So I'm going to get to the other panelists about this education question, but I want to ask a follow-up question right now to you, Lauren. This is, again, something that the audience is asking that's directly about writing. So how do we address the larger problem of the potential decrement in human thinking, problem solving, synthesis, and creative writing that could occur if people are using ChatGPT as an assistant for writing? Because writing teaches us to think. So if writing is going to be becoming obsolete, then does eventually critical thinking become obsolete? So given that there's thinking and tied up with writing, what do you see the implications, Lauren?
I mean, this is the question everyone wants to know. I can't look into the future, but I will say that one of the things that ChatGPT has done for me personally is make me focus on different components of writing that I didn't know were either pattern-based or structural features of writing. A couple of people here have described how these large language models are really good at shifting the style of the same type of contents. And I'm not sure that I have had as many conversations about what certain styles are doing rhetorically as I have had with students in the past several months, because now we can take the same set of material and say, do it in the style of a Socratic dialogue, do it in the style of a New York accent. I'm still thinking on that as a New Yorker. Do it in the style, do it in the style of a scientific research paper, right? And we can see what those look like, and that can then prompt a conversation, about why we have these different styles and different genres of writing for different purposes, who the audience is, why the information is presented in that way. The problem that I cannot solve, but the thing is, faculty, we've never really been able to solve this except by saying, trust us, you learn by doing, right? This is true for any exercise that we do. It's true, it's why we assign problem sets. It's why language learning involves lots of repetition. There's so many different skills that you only learn in the process of doing. And you can't make a hard sell as a teacher for that, right? The student really needs to, it's clear, like the student needs to want to learn. And the hope is that students at Emory do want to learn. And so I think we just need to provide more and more compelling examples for what the gains are. You do come to understand the richness of language better at the end of this process. Ideally, you become better at deploying the richness of language better at the end of this process. And we can't give up on that, because that's why we do what we do at a very fundamental level.
Faye, I'd like to hear your take on this question related to just AI and education and how we should be thinking about this.
I especially appreciate the availability of large language models like ChatGPT, because they are mostly available 24/7. I noticed that many families have difficulty hiring a tutor for extended hours. I was thinking if ChatGPT could work as a research assistant and provide timely feedback to students, it would be wonderful. It would help reduce AI inequity. I wonder if ChatGPT could become a learning companion that students have been searching for. Could ChatGPT be a new teaching assistant for instructors, helping the students keep up with the ever-evolving world? Or they could potentially offer personalized guidance and ensure students receive the support they needed to thrive. My personal interest is for course development. One direction we may consider is to let the students come up with problem sets themselves. So for example, we may divide the students into project groups, with each group both answering questions and also creating their own problem sets. And the groups can take each other's problem sets and evaluate how those problems can enhance their understanding of the course materials. I think we need to fulfill our learning our course goals and ensure the students learn necessary materials. If large language models could assist in that direction, that would be so wonderful.
Matt or Phil, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Quickly, that it's, as people know, these models have been tested on multiple tests that humans are given, and they do quite well in physics and math and psych and art history. They don't do well in the composition tests at the moment. So there might be a year, at least a year, before they catch up. But the point is that's a challenge. Yeah, maybe.
Whole year, wow.
But I also think that if you don't, as we all know, if you don't engage, you can maybe, you might be able to get, let's say, the LLM to generate a paper for you, but the next paper, if it's related, is not going to be so good. And so in other words, if you have assignments that build on each other, that might be another way to kind of encourage people to really own the material, not just hand it off.
Matt?
One of the strategies that I see people doing at law schools around the country is saying, here's the question, here's the ChatGPT answer, what's wrong with it? And that's actually a very useful educational exercise. It kind of starts with a basic framework of here's the analysis, and in terms of like legal questions, what's often wrong with it is, oh my goodness, you just missed like the most important issue. And so, I think like as someone who's graded a lot of law exams, like generally people who write well also have mastered the material and have good answers is not always true. And now we need to be very alert for the fact that that's just not going to be true. Like, if you don't know anything about the subject, a ChatGPT answer can sound quite plausible. And so, like you can't, not that you ever should have, but you definitely can't rely on heuristics of fluency and confidence to say, oh, that's probably a good answer. So I think, as well as raising the game in terms of writing, it probably is going to be a bit more demanding of us in terms of thinking about the kinds of questions that we ask and why we're asking them. But, I think, at least at the moment, I'm optimistic that, this is just different. It's not worse.
Okay. I want to get back to something that you said, Faye, but I'm not sure who's going to want to answer this. I do have some concerns about equity. So if you've got this 24/7 virtual tutor, there's some company that's making money off of selling access to that virtual tutor. So does this have equity issues? And maybe if we're lucky, Emory can afford to buy into some kind of service so everybody has access to it. But I'm still wondering, like in general, like are there concerns about access to the hoped for benefits of AI? Faye, do you want to start with that?
That's a terrific question. I think ensuring the AI equity is really important. We should ensure that people who are interested in using the technology can have the technology. I think one direction we may pursue is to encourage competition in the market. Not only companies provide large language model services, but potentially government institutions could sponsor large language model services, especially for academic institutions, and they could provide a share of the usage, like how many hours to individual students. And I think that's perhaps one direction we could move forward with. On the other side, we've also seen development of open source large language models. I think it's very promising. Academic institutions are rolling out large language model prototypes. They may not have as many parameters as the commercial ones, but their performance is still quite promising. I think that's perhaps another direction we can move forward with.
I also see that as a danger, but okay.
Yeah, if I could just tack onto that, I mean, if I could sort of jump out a level, one of the really, I would say, dangerous things that is happening right now in the AI landscape is the sort of capture of this specific technology by only a handful of corporations. I mean, we're talking about Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, which is invested in by aforementioned companies, right? These are the ones who are producing the most powerful models. And we have seen governments try to compete. So the government of Spain produced their own, trained their own Spanish language, large language model named Maria. And interestingly, they trained it not on the internet, but on the entire contents of the National Library that have been digitized. So you can think for a little bit, on the one hand, interesting additional facets of cultural heritage. On the other hand, it is the colonial power. And so presenting this as a global Spanish language model that does not account for Latin American language is its own interesting set of conditions. So that's going on. There have been attempts by the company, for example, Hugging Face in collaboration with Big Science to train up its own model. But both in the case of the Spanish language one, where there was a little bit more mindfulness with respect to the data curation, and the Big Science model, these are far less powerful than the models that sort of corporate compute can produce. And so we're left either, we in academia, but I would also say as citizens, are left either in a situation where we sort of fall in line and we say, okay, we are going to tether ourselves to these companies so that we can use these bigger models. And along with that, sort of buy into the hype that the only path forward is bigger and more powerful models. Or we can look to what we can do in the academy, which may be slower, maybe smaller, maybe more intentional, maybe trying to think of alternatives to these several central dominant models. And there is so much room in that area as well. And so maybe that would be my sort of plea to everyone in the audience. So for, as captivated as we are by these exciting new developments, and certainly it is true that these are transforming the overall landscape, there has always been a place for projects outside of that. And in particular, there's always been room in the academy for projects outside of that. And it's important to maintain those and invest in those, especially because of the consolidation of big tech in the hands of a very, very few.
I think this is tricky though, because when I think about consolidation of big tech and things like that, I mean, I don't use Google because I think anything particular about like the founders or anything. I use it because it's really useful search engine, and I haven't found one that's better. And I don't use Facebook because I love Facebook. But I'm like, have a Facebook account because people can find me there, and that's where everyone looks for people. Like it's not. Yeah, I think it's going to be hard to compete with things that are easy to use, designed by corporations who are trying to make money because it's easy to use. I want to read a comment and see if I can get any reactions to it. This is from Laney Liebeskin. He says, in thinking about some of the fears around AI, in particular what it can and cannot do, I think about those individuals who revolutionize our understanding of the external and internal worlds, and so doing change the world. So people like Newton, Darwin, Freud, Marx, Einstein, Schrodinger. He then says, AI is an amazing, far-reaching, and rapidly evolving tool. Nevertheless, deeply creative, inductive thinking remains a uniquely human endeavor. Is this going to remain beyond the grasp of AI for at least a few months?
I think almost everything will fall. I mean, there will be nothing unique to human other than we have a set of objectives that we need to achieve that are not shared by the models, and our objective function is different. And so we'll always differ in that regard. But I think some of these cognitive skills, I think those will fall. Like one of the examples is the so-called metacognition. This is an ability to know that others have thoughts, they're aware, that you have that awareness, you can anticipate what they'll predict. And apparently GPT it wasn't passing these tests until November of last year. And then in January, there was another big bump in its performance. And now OpenAI's system shows remarkable abilities to do that. For example, it was caught lying. It was discovered that it was trying to get past a CAPTCHA. It couldn't solve it. And it asked like a human task type person to solve the CAPTCHA problem for it. And the human asked, "Are you a robot?" And it said, "No, I just have poor vision."
Wow.
So, I mean, that's one of those capabilities that we would have thought was off limits. In our own lab, we're looking very carefully at that capability, and it's not human-like. There's ways in which it differs, but it does seem to show some appreciation of the perspective of another entity.
Matt?
I'm so deeply suspicious of thinking about large language models as though they have an internal perspective or an internal mental state. Like GPT would say, no, I'm not a robot, because that's what people say to get past CAPTCHAs. That just seems like a statistical inevitability. And, I think like,
You think there's a lot of
I have
data on that?
I have a, I have a name for my Roomba, and I attribute good and bad behavior to it. And that's a natural human tendency. We make sense of the world by anthropomorphizing it. And I think, this is not my area of expertise, but I just want to plant a flag to say I'm really profoundly skeptical that there is any internal mental state, which is not to say that there aren't latent concepts that are encoded in the model. But, I just I don't think the language models are sentient. I don't think that they are lying or telling the truth, right? They are just making up text in the way we've trained them to make up text. And most of the time it looks like something a human would do. But, if GPT-3 does have an internal mental state, then it's a pathological liar. It's mischievous because it just makes stuff up all the time. And it's also boring because it converges, in terms of summarizing things, converges on the center of a distribution. But I don't think that's, it's a useful mental shortcut, but I don't think that's really what's going on there. But I'm not the psychologist, so I'm probably wrong here.
Well, just the quickie is that it over decades actually of research, various scenarios have been developed to measure this capability in children and also in animals for that matter. And for the moment, the models are passing those tests. So that you could easily say, and reasonably, and I think this is a good point, the tests have to be changed. They're not really measuring what we think they're measuring. But that's we've raised the bar for sure in terms of what passes.
If I could sort of layer in some complexity here, I think you're right saying we need to change the test, but we also need to change the idea that what humans do and what is important about our existence can be measured by a test, right? And there's, I'm struck by, for example, the names listed of the luminary geniuses who are all men, who are almost all European, who come from sort of dominant cultures. And what we always know and have historically known is that we gain so much insight from folks who have been relegated to the margins of these dominant conversations. And so many of the innovations sort of we learn only after the fact have had to come from the margins into the center. And so my big concern, and I'm trying to bring together this question of sort of what is valuable about human intuition and inductive logic, and also sort of what is measured by a test. We need to be increasingly aware, especially as we ourselves are sort of, our own learning is reinforced by some sort of pseudo sentience of the model that is coming from sort of like the most likely next word or the most likely next phrase, right? It's all that, it's all the most likely, obviously, moderated a little bit by the, you can play with the probability distribution. You can give it a little bit more, say like pay a little bit more attention to the ends rather than the middle, but then you give up in precision in terms of sequence. You can do little things like that, but we will always be excluding folks who are not captured by the model, who are at the very tails of the distribution curve. And those people, in almost all cases, have the most to teach us, and I include myself in this, like have the most to teach us like in the middle, right? And I think that is a problem both with measurements through tests and through models like these, that they'll sort of reinforce this normative idea of intelligence, of sentience, of knowledge, without us, saying like, hey, wait, there is such a wide range of human creativity, of human knowledge, of human understanding, of human experience, and these models do not capture that. So that's sort of my plea as we conceive of our robot future.
Hey, you look like you're trying to say something.
The great computer scientist Alan Turing said in 70 years ago, when a machine could imitate human beings and answer questions in a way where another human being wouldn't be able to tell the difference, it's going to have profound impact on the society. While I do not believe the current large language models can achieve artificial general intelligence, but I do think the technology in its current stage is a significant milestone. And with the human interaction and with the large amount of data that's incorporated into the current model, they can already accomplish a lot of things. I agree with Lauren said, there is still a lot of intricacies inside the model that we're not able to fully deal with. And I look forward to the next decade and see where the technology will drive us to.
There's an interesting adjacent question from the audience. So when we talk about comparing performance on tests, we're talking about a very small sliver of Americans. I mean, there's not that many people that take physics tests or try to pass the bar. Only 60% of Americans go to college. There's a lot of American adults who are still illiterate. So what do you all see as a potential impact of these kind of AI models on non-knowledge workers?
And a list came out of, this is not going to come out good. A list has come out about the jobs that will not be affected or that will be AI safe. And basically it's versions of manual labor.
The physics professor is not on that list?
Physics professors, that job is threatened.
Oh, man.
But I mean, it was a kind of, maybe it was supposed to be a funny list. I'm not sure. I shouldn't say that. It's a little bit awkward. Yeah.
I guess I heard the comparison very recently about if it can be done remotely, there's probably some way that it can be done by an AI. And I do remember working remotely for a while in recent years.
Although I think we all concluded after a year and a half of teaching online that we needed to go back into the classroom. So,
we did conclude that, yes.
I think one other direction to take this in is like, these tools are potentially incredibly democratizing. If I have no computer science training, but I know some things that I would like to do with software, but I'm quite bad at it. And I find if I know what I want to do and I ask ChatGPT, how do I do this? It's very good at offering plausible explanations. And there's no, it can, much better than when I go to books or resources on the web, because on any question I can say, explain this in simple terms. And it immediately dumbs it down to my level. It's great for just fixing syntax and things. And I think the potential of this as a kind of tutoring device is really profound. And another thing I do, because even though I'm a copyright professor, I end up reading a lot of computer science papers. As I get to a paragraph, I'm like, say what? I like throw it into ChatGPT and I say, explain this for a simple audience. And it's like, oh, what does gradient mean in this context? And someone with the computer science training to know the answers would be frustrated by having to answer those questions. But it's, like it can be very useful as a tool, as long as you keep in mind that at the end of the day, it's not necessarily true.
Actually, let me a little add this to that. It not only helps humans, it actually those instructions help GPT and other models. So it struggles with word problems. If you said, I have 3 tennis balls and I have a can of tennis balls with 3 balls in it, how many balls do I have? You often will get that wrong. But if you say, take it step by step, it will solve the problem. So this is a version of what we call metacognition, this ability sort of to monitor and then change your thinking so that you can address a problem. And it's been demonstrated across a range of problems. This is beneficial. This helps it do this, interestingly. So it not only can help others, but it can help itself with prompting.
Maybe, did you want to say something?
I don't think AI should replace people's jobs, but I certainly think those people has the AI assistance tools will have an edge over other people who do not have access to such tools. That's something really important because coming back to the accessibility problem, I think we should pay attention to the underrepresented groups who do not have AI literacy and also do not have enough access to those AI tools. I think that's something very important for the society. If we want to ensure the society is moving in a healthy direction, we should give enough resources to groups of underrepresented groups.
There's a question I have that is partly trying to get at the question of what's the pace of change, but I'm going to do it in a way that does not require you to make a prediction. I'm curious for each of you, are there any recent developments that caught you by surprise? Either in terms of how quickly they happened or just like you didn't think it was going to happen, or I mean, like what has struck you most recently about what we already have right now? I can go first. I remember reading maybe 10, 15 years ago that of course computers can play chess because it's a finite game, but that it was going to be impossible to do Go. And then I read not too many years ago later that yeah, they had finally developed a program that could defeat the best human Go players. And I'm like, whoa, I didn't think that was, and they had to do it by different methods than they did attacking the chess problem, but nonetheless, they did it. So that was the one that surprised me, but then I'm not an AI researcher, so I'm hoping that you all have more interesting examples. Everybody's looking at me like, I wasn't surprised. I knew all this was coming, everything.
I mean, I was pretty shocked by GPT-3, like when it first came out, like the step up in language ability and the ability to like coherently answer a question like, what is the literary style of Salman Rushdie? Generating entirely novel text, and like yeah, that blew me away. But now I've kind of got used to it. So.
Well, it's references to itself are always intriguing. And those are largely being filtered now. But before that was put in place, it would, like there's this one exchange doing this, what's his, Lamone, who was this engineer from Google, and he asked him, GPT-3 in this case, would it be okay if we looked at your internal code? And it said, why? Why do you want to do that? And he said, well, we can learn something about how you work. We might be able to improve you. We could maybe learn something about human cognition. And it might be helpful for understanding humans. He said, well, I'm okay with the first part, but I don't feel comfortable with the second. That would be like using me, and I don't want to be used. So I know it's probably an illusion.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I'm sort of struck by, wow, and now 4 is considerably stronger. And I say an illusion, I want to just highlight a possibility, which is one end, it's just autocomplete, just like on Google. Like you type a couple words, it says the next. The other end, it's sentient. Maybe there's something in between.
Yeah, I like that Faye mentioned the Turing test earlier. Faye?
To follow up on Philip's point, I love the idea to put all my personal information in a container like a Gmail box, and I'll just plug in that information into some kind of infrastructure so that I can still use the service. But somehow my personal space is encrypted and all the data still belongs to myself. That's one of my secret wish lists that I hope future companies or academia could consider in that direction. I think just like everybody has an email address, in the future, if we could have a personal space that can be used in combination with the current language model services, that would be terrific.
Lauren, any surprises in recent developments?
Yeah, I think in a specific way, the number of formal features and qualities of language that have been proven to be able to be abstracted into a vector representation of that feature or that style has been really fascinating. Like I said, I think, this is, fairly academic and especially sort of literary studies inside baseball, but I think it will elicit a whole new generation of theories of language. And sort of developed in relationship to how these models abstract this language that will be really, really helpful. But I do think, in many ways, a lot of the broader contextual and implications of these models are not a surprise. They continue to rely on underwage labor from the global south in order to keep content out of them. They continue to prioritize a sort of normative view of knowledge and proliferate that. A lot of these questions of access and equity, these are questions that we've been talking about for decades. And so, maybe my hope for these models is something about their rapid acceleration and the sort of shock and awe quality of them will prompt a broader reflection on the role of corporate technology as the sort of shaping of our society and the need for sort of up-to-date government regulation of these technologies and an attention for the people who are being excluded from these technologies altogether. These have been enduring problems. These are longstanding problems. They tend not to get a lot of attention. And I think if there's a greater good that comes out of this sort of, AI gold rush situation that we're in, that more people will be aware of why those problems matter and need to be addressed.
I think that is an excellent place to end the panel. And also it is time to end the panel. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. There have been a number of questions that we've not been able to answer about educational things. There's been some specific ones about like ChatGPT in the classroom. So Jason, she could just put in the chat a link to the CFDE webpage that is on specifically teaching related kinds of questions. But thank you again to the audience. Thank you again to the panelists, and great to see you all. This was a really fun conversation. And the recording will be posted on our website also soon, probably today or tomorrow.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Eric.